Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to go over complex drum patterns. And when I say complex drum patterns, your mind first might be like, oh, so we're going to talk about difficult drum patterns. No, we're going to talk about a drum pattern I made, and I'm going to explain why a lot of people think complex means difficult, when in reality it's actually very simple to make complex drum patterns, and it doesn't take that much effort. So there's a lot of things that, people think of when they think of complex drum patterns, like syncopation, which is a rhythmic technique where you emphasize the weak beats or off beats in measure. But we're not going to talk about syncopation because this is less so, here's the terminology and here's exactly how you apply it, and more so just showing you how you can naturally make more complex drum patterns. Of course, when you have an idea and you want to put it into an effect, put it into like a composition, then it's good to know the terms and put everything down. But there's a lot of times in music when I'm making stuff where I'm just like, what sounds good? And after a certain amount of time, you get used to good sounding things versus not so good sounding things. And there isn't really, a good or bad essentially, but there's just some that work better in certain mixes. So I'm going to head over to Ableton and we're going to take a look at this. So this is a drum pattern I made today, and it looks like a lot because, I mean, look, it's 10 tracks. So it might be a bit confusing, but I'm going to play it. We're going to take a listen, and then I'm going to break down each part. Okay, so we don't need to look at these. These are instrument stuff that is not drum based, so we're going to hide them. But let's start from the very top. So the first thing we have here is a kick pattern. Now, this pattern itself, it's not that complex. I mean, really, we're doing this, and then we're copying it, and we're doing this, and then we're doing this thing again, right here. And then over here, we're using this section to complement the snare, which I'll talk about in a moment. But really, what a complex drum pattern is, it's a layering of many non complex, like simple patterns. Or, it can be complex. Like this is, more complex than Four on the Floor. But in reality, it's pretty simple. So if you look here, there's this thing, which, this guy has a certain amount of spacing, this guy has a certain amount of spacing. But if I were to remove elements from here, you would start to see, well, here's a better example. In the snare, if I remove this guy, and then I just make this the full thing, you see how that lines up exactly there and hits this exact note? With a complex pattern, typically you are making the snare happen more than it is typically going to happen. So like in a 4/4 pattern, we'll have like snare, 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 whatever. So like if I remove this one here and add this in, and then I go over here and add this in, and then I go over here and add this in, and then I put it over here. Then let's take a listen. What do you notice? It's in time. It's constant. No variation. Very simple. So now we could be like, okay, how do we make this better? Well, let's see. Every once in a while, why don't we snare twice? So snare and then snare. And then here, we won't talk about this part yet because that's where more variation comes in. But we'll double snare. So now if we listen, we see we have this double snare where we just doubled up the snare. And of course, really, it's kind of the wrong way to think about it is, here's the snare pattern and here's the kick pattern. It's more so thinking about how these patterns complement each other. So if we put them together here, there's a constant pattern that is within the complexity of it, but it's like you're taking a simple pattern and you're just adding a little bit to it, a little bit of ear candy, a little bit of texture, whatever. You're adding more snare, you're adding more kick, just to layer things up and then make it more interesting. Because really, you can do as simple a pattern as you want, or you can do as complex a pattern as you want. It doesn't really matter. The whole point is that you're doing something so that your listener doesn't get bored of a certain section. And that could be completely in the melody and completely in like the synths, the pianos, the guitars, whatever. But you can also do it with the drums. And sometimes it's easier to do with the drums. In my opinion, drums are one of the easiest things you can learn in just all of music in general. Of course, it's sometimes difficult to copy a drum pattern that someone else has done. That's a little difficult. It's not too hard, but there's certain issues with like syncopation and polyrhythms and whatever, which we're not going to talk about because that's when it gets complex. But just long story short, you create a pattern of kicks, you create a pattern of snares, you add a little bit more to the kicks, you add a little bit more to the snares. So that's part one, which is this. Okay, simple, right? Following so far? Now, next part, hi-hats. Let's look at the hi-hats. For this type of pattern, which is kind of just like a hip-hop, funky-ish pattern, we're not doing much. The hi-hats are always going to be like this. But of course, if you're working with like a genre of music that does more with hi-hats, like for instance, sometimes you're doing stuff with like house music or techno, maybe you want a triple or something like this, or if you're doing trap music. But again, not for this drum beat. So hi-hats typically are the one element that stays the simplest in most of the music, and then you just layer on top. Now, we're going to skip over this guy for the moment. I'll get into that in a moment. But here we have a crash, which is just kind of like a stab in a way. So that's the way that this is placed is it's a familiar sound that kind of the best way to think about it is it starts the loop. So really, this is kind of a loop. And then this is another loop. See, it lines up here, lines up here, lines up here, lines up here. Of course, in this loop, we have this different section, which sounds like this. But at the beginning of this guy, each time, we have the crash. And thus, when it does its loop, it's a set of bars, whatever, it will crash, and then you're like, okay, it's starting over again. So it's always going to be, the snare is always going to be in the same spot, and it just lines up. So with this is not needed, but this is like, just, again, it's like building on to a simple pattern to make it more complex. And typically the complexity doesn't come from, it's a 4 or 5 polyrhythm with the snare and the kick and this and this and this. But typically the complexity comes from just adding a bunch of elements on, so you're hearing a lot of things in the mix. But really, it's just a bunch of simple patterns combined together to make something that sounds more complex. So then after that, cowbells. Again, very simple pattern. I just repeat it. So like in one part here, I do a little bit of a change, and that's just to add a little bit of intrigue and difference. But in general, I do this, and then I do this, and then I click on here and I paste it in, and then I do that, and then I go to the next section, and it just loops. So then if you pay attention to the hi-hats, yeah, simple stuff, not too complex. So now here's the bottom one, which again, this is just a sound. It's like a riser, but it's something to transition into the song. It's just a scratch, like a record scratch, because it felt timely, I guess is the word, because at that time that a lot of DJs were record scratching. They still are now, but it's less so. But you do that kind of just to start the song, because this really is not supposed to be a full song. Maybe it'll turn that way, but it's just kind of a beat that maybe someone would rap over or something. And the point being is that you don't need this whole build up crazy thing. You can literally just start it with this record scratch. And it fits. It feels like it fits. It sounds like it fits. Then it probably fits. Now let's talk about this. So what this is literally nothing. It's just another drum pattern. This is literally just layering and texture, because I honestly, when I was making this, I dragged that in there once this part was made, and I was like, that sounds cool. It adds just a little bit more punch, adds a little bit more this, that, whatever. The point being is that layering helps a lot with your patterns, and sometimes if you have a pattern that doesn't sound good enough, then you maybe want to add on to it. So like, for example, let's pick this random pattern I found. We're going to drag this down here, and then let's listen to it. And then let's hear it without it. See how it sounds more flatter and less interesting? This one, I didn't build this pattern. I just found this sample, found a loop here, I just put it down, and it worked fine. And that's okay. With the complexness of patterns, once you start just adding stuff on top of each other, the simple pattern becomes more complex, if that makes sense. So all I really wanted to do was, A, show off this cool pattern I made, but also tell you that making complex patterns is not this thing that you have to spend a while learning. A lot of people, think it is. Of course, if you play the drums, then sure, you got to learn how to do complex drumming. But with Ableton, with DAWs, you can just program in exactly what you want at whatever speed you want without any problems. So your challenge for the end of this video is to go out, make a complex drum pattern of some type. It could be from any genre. It could be your own creation. It could be, you could remake Funky Drummer. You could remake Amen Break if you want to. It's up to you. But just create some drum pattern and practice making it more complex. Another point of this video is also to be like, it may seem daunting to do these complex drum patterns and to make your mixes more interesting with drums, but it's not. Once you get started, you realize that it's actually really fun. And not only is it fun, but you get to create some really cool sounding things. And then you get to be happy with your creations. So that's your challenge, and that's the point of this video. I don't really have much more to add, but I love every single one of you guys. I will see you guys soon. All right.